There's been a lot of talk over time about the GBA, and there's been a lot of activity. A lot of the activity that has taken place within Guangdong province itself and is not familiar to many in Hong Kong. But what we do see, again, starting with China's economic opening, going through Deng Xiaoping's southern tour, the return of both Macau and Hong Kong to Chinese administration, the 2008, some of you may recall, there was a State Council NDRC document on further developing the Pearl River Delta economic zone at that time. The portions of that initiative that affected Hong Kong and Macau most directly were the agreements to actually go ahead with the big infrastructure projects that have resulted in the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge and also the Hong Kong connection through the XRL to China's high-speed rail system. Otherwise, there wasn't a whole lot of activity in Hong Kong or Macau, but there was a huge amount of activity in Guangdong that resulted in terms of further economic integration, transportation planning, etc., that, again, a lot of people in Hong Kong just aren't aware of. And what is certainly true over the last few years is an acceleration of activity with the signing of the framework document on Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau collaboration and cooperation, and then, of course, the State Council document that was released in February of this year. So there is a question of, is this the next iteration? Is this the next round? And is there anything different? And I would say there is a number of things, or there are a number of things that are different. One is that the level of development in the region is far different from the region we were talking about 10 years ago. And in some ways, there are additional opportunities for collaboration, coordination, for mutual benefit than existed even a few years ago. A second difference is the connectivity that we talked about needing 10, 12 years ago now exists for all intents and purposes, certainly to a much greater extent than was the case then. And it's not just connectivity between Hong Kong and Shenzhen or Hong Kong and the west side of the Delta. It's connectivity throughout the region. And then the third thing is that while in 2008 the State Council NDRC document made a lot of suggestions for pushing the region forward, we didn't have at that time a small leading group chaired by a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo in charge of actually getting things done. Okay? And those differences, in our view, are major differences. And they actually mean that what we're seeing today is the potential to take the development of the region another step or a few steps forward. When we look at the region as a whole, often what we see is people adding up statistics and saying, gee, it's big. We're like, well, yeah, it is. But to us, what's more interesting is what people tend not to talk about. And that is, what is the economic trajectory of the region going to look like? And in our view, it's actually pretty straightforward. That what we're seeing go into place, particularly now with the infrastructure that's available, is the development of an urban inner ring, which already goes Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Guangzhou, around into Foshan. But eventually that'll go all the way around to Macau. It's just a matter of time. And that inner ring will be where the headquarters operations are, the high-end technology development, the high-tech manufacturing, the most advanced producer and consumer services, etc. That will be where the high value is generated. And then what we'll see in the wings in places like Huizhou, like Zhaoqing, like Jiangmen, but also in the wings, the outer portions of places like Guangzhou and Foshan, is all the support structures and the support industries that never were in Guangdong before. If you go city by city and look at the economic structure of all the cities of the region, you find out quite quickly that this region is still dominated by assembly manufacturing in a small number of industries. Basically, consumer electronics, telecom-related equipment, etc. But now we have a $1.5 trillion, $1.6 trillion US dollar GDP economy. We have 70 million people. We now have the economic size and the economic throw weight to support the vertical integration into the mid-tech, into all the materials that go into supporting an economy of 70 million people. Right? We never needed those in Guangdong in the past. Remember, Guangdong was the backward portion of China. And with the breakneck sort of growth that has been exhibited since the onset of China's reform program, we never caught up with all the economic structures and all the industries required to support an economy of 70 million people. And as that economy becomes more mature, as it moves up the development ladder, as automation replaces a lot of the low-end workforce, what we're going to see is a much more stable population, a much more permanent population, which implies a completely different profile in terms of demand for consumer goods, demand for consumer services. This is not a prediction. This is not a projection. This is a fact of life that is going on today. It's not surprising that BASF, for example, has committed $10 billion to chemical facilities in Guangdong. We now have the economy in the region to support it. And again, any of you who know about the economic geography of China, once you get beyond the sort of inner ring of the GBA, you have to go hundreds of kilometers before you get to any other significant economic concentrations. So all this is catch-up, right? Which is why I'm so confident in predicting that that's what's going to happen. It's already happening. And each of the cities will take on, and in some cases continue to have, complementary roles. Guangzhou is the administrative center for a province of 100 million people. It will be the place, the South China headquarters for all the big state-owned companies, for the state banks. It will be the center for marketing, sales, and support for a province, again, of 100 million people. It will be a mid-tech manufacturing center par excellence, including the automotive and everything that goes with that. Shenzhen has emerged as the most dynamic place in China for startups. We do a lot of work at Enright, Scott & Associates all around China, north, south, east, west, and everywhere we go, when we say, where's the best place in China to do a tech startup, everybody, without exception, says Shenzhen. Far better than Beijing, far better than Shanghai. Shenzhen is the place. So Shenzhen has become the magnet that's attracting the high-tech entrepreneurs, at least a substantial portion of them, from all over China, right? In addition, obviously, logistics, the ports, the airports, et cetera. Hong Kong, again, not rivaled in the region as a center for international finance, international trading, logistics, but increasingly also Hong Kong is viewed as the place to access the ideas and the information from the rest of the world. Right? China's cybersecurity laws actually hugely benefit Hong Kong. Because the access that we can have seamlessly in Hong Kong to global sources of information, knowledge at our fingertips is a huge benefit, not just for Hong Kong, but for the rest of the region as well. Macau, well, there's only 31 square kilometers of Macau, right? So there's not a whole lot there. And when you sort of saturate it out with casinos and resorts, there's not a whole lot else to do there. But what's interesting is we are seeing in Hengqin Island at least the start of a spillover of Macau into Zhuhai. The notion that Macau might provide a critical mass in the west side of the delta that Hong Kong did in the east, well, people realize that that's not really the case, right? Macau is so much smaller. But Macau has its purpose. It has its function in the region. Foshan and Dongguan, in different industries and in different ways, are emerging as the manufacturing powerhouses of the region. Dongguan largely replacing the traditional labor-intensive investments by largely Hong Kong firms with higher-end investments from Shenzhen firms, who are now moving their production out of Shenzhen because it's too expensive to do it there into Dongguan. That's the major dynamic. There are hundreds of firms relocating manufacturing to Dongguan, keeping R&D and headquarters in Shenzhen. The portion of Dongguan's industrial output used to be 75, 80% by foreign invested enterprises. That's down around 60% and dropping rapidly. It's now becoming a place where Chinese companies are doing manufacturing for the domestic as well as international market. Foshan historically was the only city in the PRD that always had the vast majority of its industrial output by indigenous firms. A lot of that was in things like ceramics, home appliances, etc. And what we've seen in Foshan over the last several years is an attempt to really drive up the value-added ladder by automating in the traditional sectors and also bringing in more enhanced design services, R&D services, engineering services to try to supercharge the manufacturing economy there. Zhuhai is an interesting case because just as Hong Kong and Shenzhen provide the high and medium-end services for the east portion of the PRD, we see Zhuhai eventually taking on that role to a certain extent in miniature in the western part of the PRD, because those activities will have to be carried out. It's not going to be cost effective to do those from Hong Kong and Shenzhen or even Guangzhou. So that's what we're going to see in Zhuhai, along with the spill out of activities from Macau. But also Zhuhai is basically, if you look in detail at the economic structure, it is a miniature of Shenzhen. If you look at the percentages of industries in the two different places, it's eerie how similar they are, which implies to us that as the connectivity between East and West improves, as costs go up in Shenzhen, as the entrepreneurial activities start taking over in Shenzhen, that a lot of the activities there will decant quite easily either across to Zhuhai or into Dongguan or out into Huizhou. Zhongshan I already mentioned a bit. You know, it's coming down from Guangzhou, Foshan, up from Zhuhai. It'll take a while. And then Huizhou, Jiangmen, Zhaoqing, this is where the lower value added, the heavier industry, the industries that are intensive users of land and resources are going to go. And again, this is already happening. It's already happening in the region. So when we see the opportunities, again, fast forwarding a bit, for Hong Kong and Hong Kong companies, we see the opportunities coming from 5 different places. First is the economic size and growth of the region. The second is from greater connectivity. The third is from further economic opening. The fourth is from people-centric policies and programs. And then the last one is our old favorite one country, two systems. And I'll go quickly through each of these. First off, as I said before, and as Aaron started us with, you know, the GBA economy is roughly 1.6 trillion US dollars these days in you know, annual GDP. Some of the more aggressive projections going forward have that reaching 3.6 trillion US dollars by 2030. Now that would be a growth rate of 7% per year. And as China is sort of slowing down 6.5%, a little less, that might be a bit ambitious. But even if we were to back off the projected growth rate to 5%, we still get to 3.6 trillion US dollars, but we do it by 2035 rather than 2030. You know, who cares, right? We're going to have an economy, a regional economy, twice the size or more than it is today. Whether it reaches it in 2030, 2035, who cares? It's twice the size of the economy that's in the region today, more than twice the size. That's an opportunity. If we look at how this is playing out, historically, back in the old days, the region had one lead economic city, Hong Kong. That is no longer true. Last year, Shenzhen passed Hong Kong in terms of GDP size. Guangzhou will probably pass us this year, and that is not a bad thing. What it means is that we have now 3 leading economic cities in the region, creating or at least exhibiting a clear first tier of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. The second tier, again, significantly lower, is Dongguan, Foshan, both between 120, 140 billion US in GDP, and then everybody else in the region is down around 50, right? And remember that Shenzhen, when China started to open, was nowhere, right? Was smaller than most of the other cities on this chart, okay? So we now have 3 lead cities, not just one. And in fact, in 1997, well, I moved to Hong Kong in 96. First big project that I did in the region was along with my friend David Dodwell in 1997, looking at Hong Kong and how it was interacting with the rest of the region. At that time, Hong Kong's GDP was 3 times that of the 9 Pearl River Delta cities combined. In 2017, the GDP of the 9 Pearl River Delta cities combined was 3 times that of Hong Kong. And if we simply take the growth projections out forward, obviously that gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And some of my friends in Hong Kong says, oh no, this means we're being left behind. I say, baloney. It means that we have a much bigger market to address if we figure out how to do it. Right? The notion that Hong Kong was going to remain the dominant economy in a region with 10 times its population only makes sense if one were predicting that China's development would absolutely fall flat. Right? There is no other scenario in which Hong Kong would have remained the dominant economy in the region, and quite frankly, that would be a very bad future for Hong Kong, not a very good future. Right? I've always come back to the question of, will Hong Kong fall behind, with an answer that says, which is better for Hong Kong? A China that's growing rapidly and interacting with the rest of the world, or a China that's stagnant, flat, and not going anywhere? Right? It's not hard to figure that out. Does it mean we'll have increasing competition in a whole range of industries and activities? Yeah, so be it. If we look at the greater connectivity, our focus in Hong Kong has tended to be Hong Kong's connectivity across the region. But there are different levels of connectivity that have been going on for quite some time. We do have the best links to the global economy as pretty much anywhere in the world. We have 3 of the world's top 7 container ports. Depending on whether you look at cargo or passengers, both. We have 2 of the world's top 15 airports, including Hong Kong, the leading airport for international and air cargo of all sorts. We have each of those, right? Hong Kong airport is congested, right? We're full up here. We need the 3rd runway. Baiyun is expanding. Foshan has a new airport on the drawing board. Guangzhou wants a 2nd airport. And we're still underserved when it comes to air traffic, if we look at the population in the region. On the port side, we're not expanding so much in Hong Kong, but the question is it cost effective to expand in Hong Kong? While we're seeing expansion in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, et cetera. And even though it looks like Shenzhen and Guangzhou are replacing Hong Kong, the reality is Shenzhen is a direct competitor in some senses with the port in Hong Kong, but a lot of the stuff that comes out of Guangzhou actually winds up being transshipped through Hong Kong before it addresses or gets to world markets. It used to be the vast majority of the goods that came in and out of Hong Kong came across the border by truck. That's no longer the case. Now most of that comes either in or out up the river traffic by sea. So we have the global links where we're quite well situated. And remember, we're still roughly a 5-hour flight from half of the world's population, and eventually a third, 35, even 40% of the global economy, and there's no other region in the world that can say that, right? There's no other place in the world that captures all of Southeast Asia, the vast majority of China, a third of India, all of Korea, all of Japan. Shanghai doesn't do it, Beijing doesn't do it. It's only the GBA that does that. So in many ways, we're at the center of the future of the world economy. It's just a matter of figuring out what to do about that. China itself, if we look at the links between the GBA and the rest of China, particularly through the high-speed rail network, that has dramatically improved over just the last few years, right? We've had for a while the links to Shanghai, the links to Beijing, Wuhan, et cetera, but we now also have the links to South and Southwest China through the high-speed rail network that, again, we never had before. And then, of course, the links that we tend to talk about are the cross-boundary links. But again, we often overlook in Hong Kong the massive investments that have been made on the Guangdong side in the GBA. 10, 12 years ago, when we were doing another major study of the region, we said, well, wait a minute, the land transportation in this part of Guangdong is probably the worst of any major metropolitan area in China. It's now probably the best. Okay? It's moved that far in just the last 10 or 12 years. Now, here, the left diagram, when we did an experiment with my team, we gave everybody some pocket money and said, how far can you get from Central in 1, 2, or 3 hours? And in 2010, that was the diagram. And that was through judicious use of train, ferry, car, whatever mechanism available. And remember, a lot of the decision makers, the people who own the factories, the people who manage from Hong Kong out in the region, the high-end service providers, they couldn't get that far because they don't take the ferry, they take the BMW or the Mercedes, right? And in fact, for many years, that's what determined economic development in the region. In 2002, Financial Times, Tom Mitchell wrote an article based on work we were doing at the time that said the Mercs determine economic development in the Pearl River Delta. And he was right. Of course he was. He was copying our stuff. Sorry, apply your own discount factor. In 2018, after the opening of the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge and the XRL, we did the same experiment. Okay? How far could you get? 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? Why 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? 1 hour is commute. I mean, my father used to commute 2 hours a day on the Long Island Expressway just to get from Nassau County to Queens in New York, and those are adjacent counties even, right? So 1 hour is a pretty easy commute, quite frankly. And now you can get not just to Guangzhou South, you can go to Shenzhen, you can get on the train heading east, you can get to the center of Huizhou, you can actually get pretty far in an hour. 2 hours, you fill out a lot of the inner portion of the PRD, and in 3 hours, you can get to a huge portion of the PRD as a whole. Why is 3 hours important? Anywhere in the world, 3 hours is a compact economic region. Get out early, spend 2/3 of a day on site, get back home at night. And what does that do for you? That means that economic development at any part of the region can potentially benefit every other part of the region. And over the last few years, we've more than doubled the land mass that's accessible to do that, right? And we've already seen the results of it. We're seeing companies that historically did the bulk of their manufacturing in Shenzhen now opening up facilities in places like Jiangmen and Zhaoqing because they can now get there. They can manage at that distance because the time is similar, okay? And a lot of people just haven't realized it yet. Not long ago, again, I took another Saturday exercise for the team, forced them to work on Saturday. We started in Hong Kong. We went across to West Kowloon. We got on the train. We had breakfast in Shenzhen, lunch in Guangzhou, dinner in Zhuhai, caught a show in Macau. We were back in Hong Kong before midnight. Right? And even 2 years ago, 18 months ago, that would not have been possible. But the vast majority of people in Hong Kong don't understand this. I'm a classical music buff. About 3 months ago, the Berlin Philharmonic came to the region. If they had come to Hong Kong, it would have been sold out 3 months in advance. They came to Shenzhen. Nobody in Hong Kong had any clue that they came, right? This is just wrong, right? We need to start thinking about the region through the accessibility. You want to have lunch in Stanley, well, you can get to Shenzhen just as quickly. You can get to Zhuhai just as quickly, right? So we need to open our minds a bit. We have the outline development plan for the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, a very interesting document. If you read it down, it looks like they're bending over backwards to accommodate Hong Kong and Macau. And for those of us who may have some concerns about the future of one country, two systems, that's a good thing. However, anyone who's experienced in reading NDRC documents will soon recognize this as an absolutely stock standard central planning document with Hong Kong and Macau characteristics. Okay? So a lot of talk about the development based on market orientation and the separate status of Hong Kong and Macau, but that sort of is in chapters 7, 8, and 9, and the well over 120 tech sectors that will be targeted and developed in the region, that's in chapter 4. So remember, the market is the market with Chinese characteristics, okay? And we need to think about this document, however, in terms of how we can use it going forward. And here, I'll harken back to how I spend much of my days these days, which is working with foreign multinationals and accessing the China market. And what we do for the foreign multinationals is we take the governing documents and we find anything in those documents that supports what the companies need to do for their own business purposes. And we suggest that Hong Kong companies do absolutely the same, right? What the mainland has done is it's opened up its industrial support programs to Hong Kong companies. Hey, if you're in one of the targeted sectors, go stick your hand out and get your piece of the pie. It's there for you to get, right? We need to think a little differently about these documents. This document is a treasure trove in terms of identifying in broad-based terms opportunities for further opening, further interaction, further activity by Hong Kong individuals and Hong Kong companies in Guangdong province. Use it that way, right? Use it that way. If we think about the other aspects that are embedded in this document, a commitment to expand SEPA, but in some sectors listed exactly which sectors are going to be open further. But my suggestion is let's take that a bit farther. Say, okay, of the 160 service industries identified under SEPA, 153 of them have some opening to Hong Kong and Macau under SEPA, but only 62 of them have national treatment. So 153 minus 62, that's an interesting target. In what order? I don't care. Alphabetical order, right? But we have the target. We have a commitment that there will be further opening. Let's figure out which ones to go after. The Guangdong Free Trade Zone and the 13 different provincial level demonstration zones for the liberalization of service trade between Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau. How many people have even heard of them? Right? The Guangdong Free Trade Area we may have, but these 13 zones for service sector opening and cooperation, each of which has policies to promote Hong Kong companies and Hong Kong individuals to invest there, to live there, to work there. How many of us have gone and figured out where they are and how to leverage them for our own purposes? My guess is relatively few. And again, the outline plan goes through many other examples of further opening that is planned. If we look at the people-centric policies and programs that have come down from the mainland, basically they make living, working, and playing by Hong Kong people in the GBA easier. Now, does this mean a massive number of Hong Kong people are suddenly going to pick up, having seen the light, and go across the border to live, work, and play? Answer, no. Right? It's going to be gradual. But it's quite substantial when the mainland says you can live in Hong Kong, work in the GBA, and we'll tax you at Hong Kong rates. I wouldn't have even asked for that, right? I would have been too embarrassed to ask for that, right? But the mainland has offered that, right? Special tax treatment for us. Similarly, the incentives for Hong Kong people to start up firms, to invest in technology, et cetera, et cetera. It's all there. It's just a matter of how much we want to take advantage of it. It's our choice. And under one country, two systems, again, multiple commitments along the way to preserve one country, two systems. And to us, what's critical is that when we look at the economic development in the region and what needs to happen, Hong Kong doesn't have to be absorbed into Guangdong to make it work, right? You can have very strong interaction. We've had it at increasing levels since 1979, 1980, as long as you negotiate the interfaces. And basically, the interfaces are still there. There are still frictions. Obviously, there are still border checkpoints. There are still customs rules and regs, but they're starting to get streamlined, right? The documentation for traded goods, they're trying to unify so the same set of documents can be submitted in Hong Kong, mainland Macau. The three places can still have their different standards, but if it's one set of documents, it's a whole lot easier. So we have a number of things that are going on. While retaining the two systems aspect. Why? Because it's beneficial not only for Hong Kong, but it's beneficial for the mainland as well. As long as the mainland chooses not to be completely open in terms of capital flows, people flows, information flows, and, you know, 15 years ago, people were telling me, oh, the renminbi can be convertible in 5 years. And then 10 years ago, people said the renminbi will be convertible in 5 years. And about 5 years ago, people just stopped talking about it, right? Because what we've seen is a re-centralization of control within the mainland, which, if anything, prolongs and extends the benefits that Hong Kong's one country, two systems has. Because what is the role, for example, that Hong Kong is supposed to play in developing technology in the region? It doesn't make sense to do large-scale R&D in Hong Kong. It's just too expensive, right? Central cities tend to do things like medical research around teaching hospitals, AI, software, fintech, where you can have potentially very high return for limited space and a small number of high-value people. But the value of Hong Kong in terms of the technology development of the region is going to be as the conduit for international information flows, idea flows, and people flows. Okay? So again, we just need to think about the benefits of two systems as well as the benefits of one country. So what does this mean ultimately in terms of opportunities for Hong Kong? In our view, there are opportunities in a number of ways. Because we see opportunities in new and old roles, in new and old industries, in old and new or new and old geographies. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, we're not going to go out and put traditional industries in Shenzhen going forward. But we can think long and hard about putting them in Zhaoqing, Jiangmen, right? And in fact, again, Shenzhen, Guangzhou may not need Hong Kong financial managerial expertise, but I can tell you the Weizhous, Jiangmins, Zhaoqings certainly do. And if we look at some of the more advanced industries, again, you know, we're not going to be producing here the high-tech widgets, but we ought to be financing them. And when BASF and other big companies go to put the materials in, be it chemicals, papers, steel, all the materials, capital goods that go into supporting this economy of 70 million people, we ought to be managing that financial flow. We ought to be organizing that trade one way or another, right? So old and new roles, old and new industries, old and new geographies. And for each company, there'll be a different mix of old and new at, again, the activity, industry, and geography level that's worth looking into. We've made a number of suggestions to improve the region that are in the document. I won't go into those in detail. Obviously, a big step would be taking the mainland at its word and furthering economic opening and reform, creating the regional development issues, be they thinking about a smart region as opposed to smart cities. Right? Nowhere else in the world do we have the same density and the same interaction among large cities that we have in the region. And then there are all sorts of business promotion activities that we don't do or don't do all that well in the region. There's enhancing the GBA workforce, right? How many of our people entering the workforce both have a suitable job-ready skill and have knowledge of the GBA? The answer is not enough. We need to think about some of the coordinating organizations and institutions across the GBA. But maybe the critical thing that we need to do at this point is just work to increase people's understanding of what the possibilities are within the region. And then from Hong Kong's standpoint, particularly, we need to recognize, that we're a city in a big region. We're not the dominant player anymore, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means we have a much larger market to play with. We need to think about what the opportunities are, activities, industries, geographies. Think about, again, everybody is not going to rush across the boundary, but it's going to start making more and more sense for small companies run by, professionals in their 30s and 40s that may do 60, 70, 80% of their business in the PRD. It's going to start making sense for them to think about living in Shenzhen, living in Dongguan, making the links that way. And then again, we can choose to be part of the reform process and the development process of the GBA and help shape it or not, and then just follow it. Again, that's our choice. So our view is that there are quite substantial opportunities, the connectivity, the growth in the region, the new policies that are in effect, combined with our traditional one country, two systems. And I'll stop it there, and we can open it up to discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Enright. I'm fan of all his work. I brought the books I have. I basically read all your books. One of the questions I was asking, this book was published in 2003, and over the lunch, and I asked Professor Enright why we need the GBA. And basically, maybe he already explained the connectivity is different, and now it's under a leadership group, so that is different. But what I still think that Hong Kong people may need to change is kind of the mindset. Somehow here you mentioned one of the limitations for Hong Kong could be the mindset of the people. Do you see and feel that after 13 years we change? Are we ready for this?
Well, I think some people certainly have, and certainly there are many Hong Kong businesses that have been exploring and exploiting the interaction for decades. However, for a number of those companies, the economic rationale behind, again, the initial low-wage manufacturing in the region has now changed. And a number of the industries that will be growing in the region, be they on the high-tech side, but also in terms of, basic industry, heavy industry, are not industries that historically we've had here in Hong Kong. It doesn't mean there are still opportunities for Hong Kong, but we have to expand our mindset in terms of how we here in Hong Kong can perform, be it financial activities, managerial activities, information-related activities for this wider set of industries than we're used to. Another thing is that still, if we look at the cross-boundary surveys of the Hong Kong government, the vast majority of the interaction of Hong Kong people with the GBA is Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and then a bit in Dongguan and Guangzhou. It's really shocking the limited extent to which Hong Kong people in general get to the rest of the region. So there are brand new geographies. And again, as I said before, the places that are most advanced in the region, the Guangzhous, the Shenzhens, in many ways, they're self-sufficient. They can work with Hong Kong in some areas, but they don't need Hong Kong. Whereas when you go to places like Zhaoqing, you go even to places like Foshan, and they say, well, how do I access international markets? I need help, right? So again, in order to understand those activities, we're not going to be able to exploit those opportunities just sitting here in Hong Kong and waiting for them to come to us. We're going to have to go out and find those opportunities and make those links.
Now I would like to open the floor for questions. Any questions from the floor? Oh, Dominic, okay.
I'm Dominic Yin. You mentioned about the 7% growth every year to reach 3.5 billion in 2030. But according to the 25% import duty increase, do you still believe there will be 7% growth every year? And do you think this will be a very bad thing for the region, or is just the opposite, that will encourage and enforce them to upgrade themselves in Greater Bay Area? And the second question may be very crazy. The second question is, if we do a good job here in Hong Kong, leading the growth of GBA, do you think in 10 or 20 years there will be Hong Kong metropolitan, to group them together to make a big Hong Kong metropolitan city with managed with our laws? Thank you.
Answer to the second question first, no. And the reason for that is that, we're not talking about taking over a weak sister in terms of Shenzhen. Shenzhen has its own dynamic. It's doing quite well under its own situation with its own laws, etc. So I don't see Shenzhen interested in changing, and I don't see why the mainland would change or do that. It just doesn't strike me as something of interest, and I certainly wouldn't think of trying to expand Hong Kong that, in a sense, put the customs border on the other side of Shenzhen. Just do the thought experiment. If you're sitting in Shenzhen, where would you rather have the border? Between you and the rest of the mainland, 1.3 million people, or between you and Hong Kong? I think it's an absolute no-brainer. Okay? So I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think it needs to happen, because I don't think that the economic logic drives it in that direction. Okay? The first question is, again, my view is that we have trade friction. We don't have it because of a particular administration either in China or the US. What we have is a situation where the last time that China's interface with the global economy was negotiated was when China joined the WTO. That's a long time ago. And I think there was a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of false hopes on both sides, and that now both sides understand that you have a system in China that is strong and it has its own internal logic. You have a system in the West which is strong, has its internal logic. Those systems aren't going to change. They're fundamentally different, and the only way to do business when you have systems that are that different is that every now and then you have to renegotiate the interface. If both sides understand that that's what the game is, then I would expect to see a solution that neither side is happy with, but that both sides can live with. Okay? If we see a continuation, so again, we think that there'll be ongoing negotiations, ongoing tensions, but we don't see, a trade war at the level we're seeing now with the tariffs. We don't see that going on indefinitely. at all. We think it's a blip and that there has to be a renegotiation. And as soon as both sides realize that, we're not as far from, I think, a resolution as one might think. When I looked at the projections before, the point I made was that even if 7% is beyond the reach of the region, even if it's 5% growth, that still gets us to 3.6 trillion by 2035 instead of 2030. If the trade tensions continue, what it will do is it will accelerate the adjustment. When we look at the bulk of the growth that's going to happen in the future, we actually don't think it's going to be in the export sector anyway, because China will reach a certain saturation in terms of the industries in which it's successful in international trade. And what we will see is that the bulk of the future development will be more towards filling in all the pieces of a strong domestic economy. So for example, when we compare the region's economy, we actually don't compare to the San Francisco Bay Area or New York Metro or Tokyo Bay. We compare to South Korea. Because right now, if you look at it, South Korea is roughly the same economic size. It already shows us what has to be backfilled in order to have a vertically integrated economy. And to get to South Korea's level of development, it's about a 33% stretch from where we are now. That's to us a reasonable target. Going from GBA per capita income of 22,000 US per year to the San Francisco Bay Areas, which is 102,000 US per year, you just don't get from here to there, right? There's not a reasonable pathway. And when we look at that $3.6 trillion economy, we still don't compare it to San Francisco Bay, New York, or Tokyo Metro. We actually compare it to Germany. Because if we have the population in the region grow from 70 to about 82 million, GDP 3.6 trillion, that's what Germany was in 2017. Which is really interesting if you think about it, because it's still a heavily manufacturing economy. Also, it's a high-tech economy. It's a sophisticated economy. And while the stretch in terms of adjusting of institutions and all the other things to go from where we are to South Korea's level is not that great, the changes to get to Germany's level are quite substantial. So that's the comparison that we do. We think that's just a more interesting and a more apt comparison than the various Bay Areas.
Oh, Aaron.
Michael, you were talking about taxation, and you said you would be embarrassed to ask the central government to have Hong Kong taxation for companies and individuals who are actually resident over here, traveling 183 days, under 183 days to the GBA. I think it's actually a great incentive by the central government to entice Hong Kong companies, international companies that are going to set up shop in Hong Kong, to be able to go up to the GBA and do business. My question is slightly different. If the incentive is to live in Hong Kong and to set up your company in Hong Kong for international companies or people in the GBA, is there not much more pressure on Hong Kong's housing, for example?
Answer yes. And my view is that Hong Kong people, are pretty sharp with the pencil, and that they'll look at the combination of their tax rate, their income, and their costs, and that will factor into the discussion of where they choose to live, where they choose to work. Again, if we look at Hong Kong's housing issue, and again, one thing I didn't specifically state is that I don't think it's rational for Hong Kong to look to the GBA to solve Hong Kong core issues. It's not up to the GBA to solve, what happens with Hong Kong youth who can't afford to live in Hong Kong. It's not up to the GBA to solve the issue of the elderly from Hong Kong retiring and being in an expensive Hong Kong. We need to address those issues here. And we need to expect that the mainland will do what it wants to do. Because if you look from a mainland side, what those incentives, what that tax treatment does, what the incentives for Hong Kong individuals in the Guangdong Free Trade Zone, what those encourage is for Hong Kong people with skills and capabilities to set up their business there rather than here. And in fact, our Guangzhou-based research team, the head of our Guangzhou-based research team said, why in the world do you in Hong Kong talk about sending your young people here to start companies? Don't you want them to start companies in Hong Kong? And it's like, well, yeah, duh. And so our view is that anything that makes Hong Kong a more attractive place, again, potentially puts pressure on the housing. From the mainland standpoint, it's not that they're out to solve Hong Kong's housing problem, it's that they want the skilled people setting up businesses on the mainland side. And again, housing we've got to solve here. They're not going to solve it for us.
Hi, Professor Enright, Jennifer. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was most helpful. Over the past 15 months or so, there's been endless PRs from the Hong Kong government, including HKGCC, talk about how great the GBA is, and including your presentation, the last slide, you said, come and grasp it, the opportunity is now. If I were to ask you a question, because I think people have heard enough of people saying, you know, how great the GBA area is. You quoted the example of BASF. I don't think the Hong Kong government has ever marketed to BASF how great the GBA opportunity is. How can the Hong Kong government or the HKGCC potentially market the GBA differently from just saying that you have to grasp it now? If you don't do this, you know, it's the loss of the opportunity. You know, is there any way for the government to market it slightly differently? Because, you know, our group run businesses in the entire GBA area. When I speak with the Chinese governments regionally, including Foshan and all of them, they don't really, to be honest, they don't really care about Hong Kong. They just get on with themselves, and Foshan probably talk to Guangdong more often than Foshan talk to Hong Kong, right? So how can we, Hong Kong, think about marketing GBA differently? And you know, everyone just talks about the same thing. We've heard the 70 million, we heard the 1.6 trillion. If I ban you from marketing all those figures, you know, is there another way to market that?
Yep. We have to get more granular. It has to be, it's a big market, so what? Okay? We got to go to the next step. We have to say, okay, what industries are going to develop within that market? What are my bets? Again, for any of you interested, building materials, mid-tech, everything that goes into the urbanization and industrialization of an economy of 70 million people. It's mid to high-end consumer goods. It is all the consumer services that never developed in Guangdong because of the population skewed by relatively low-wage migrant workers. So it's education services, it's healthcare services, it's leisure services. It's everything that the new GBA person is going to be interested in. Because that person on average in the future is not going to be a low-wage assembly worker. They're going to be somebody working in robotics. They're going to be somebody working in software. They're going to be somebody working in the logistics sector. So that's why I say traditional industries, traditional roles in traditional industries in new geographies. Traditional roles in new industries in some old geographies, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, right? So we've got to get to that level, right? And how are people going to, and it's really a matter, it's not even to me a matter of marketing. Marketing is almost the wrong word. It's how do we provide the information so that people can use it. So the GBA, great, I mean, who cares, right? It's, okay, what's the opportunity in my industry, right? But again, government can, you know, provide a basis, but then people, companies have to go out and do their own exploration. But to me, it's information sharing and transfer rather than marketing that matters. Because quite frankly, I think a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done.
I really always just macro, macro, macro. No one really understands what the opportunity.
Well, that's because no one has done the analysis. No, seriously, nobody has done the analysis to go industry by industry, and it may not be the Hong Kong government's job to do that.
Yeah. And the sponsors are all from, there aren't many Hong Kong origin background sponsors for the exercise either. So you can see how Hong Kong companies are not really getting it.
We had a wonderful sponsor group. They supported us in many ways.
Thank you.
I have time for one last question. Maybe if I may take the opportunity to ask one more recent